Hey everybody, welcome back to the greatest place for classic Mercedes on the web, Pierre Hedary's Classic Mercedes channel. And today we're going to discuss the cliched statement, the cheapest, the most expensive car you can buy is a cheap Mercedes. So again, the most expensive car you can buy is a cheap Mercedes. Now, is that true or is it not true? I'm going to actually take this statement and dissect it and debunk it and explain to you why actually sometimes it pays to buy a cheaper car. So, first of all, let's look at a couple different tiers of Mercedes Benz. The first one is going to be the 1972 and earlier old-timer class. Then we're going to look at young timers, which are 72 and later, 72 to like 95. And then we're going to look at the modern Mercedes product, 95 and beyond. Really, the modern Mercedes product is going to be W140 and R129 going ahead. So there's some young timer and some modern influence there that converges between 1990 and 1995. So people say this often because they lack the ability to work on their car themselves. So what they're talking about is buying the cheapest example in the market of a given car, whether it's a 280 SL or a 300D, and then taking it to a mechanic and having them go through the car. But in this day and age, we find that you can go out and buy, I don't know, let's take a 280 SE 4.5. You could buy the most expensive example in the market, and then you can buy a cheap car, and you can find that the difference between the two cars is really $40,000 or $50,000 in body and structural repairs, or maybe another extra $2,000 or $3,000 in some minor items. So when do you stay away from a cheap car? Well, you stay away from a cheap car when it has significant rust or body damage, or when the car's interior is just absolutely kaput, or when there may be something really bad that happened to it, like a major electrical fire. Now, if you're looking at an inexpensive Mercedes, but the condition is pretty decent, like let's say we find a 280 SE 4.5 that looks nice, runs and drives, and has a bunch of good qualities, like a nice original interior for $25,000. Let's say we find a non-running car that's been parked for 20 years in dry storage that has a nice body and paint, but is a group of mechanical unknowns that costs about $6,000. I would probably look at the $6,000 car because I don't think the difference is going to be $19,000 in repairs between one and the other. And if it is, you're probably going to have a slightly better car because in that $19,000 package, you'll end up replacing all your rubber mounts and bushings and going through the brakes. So if you were to take the $6,000 car and spend $19,000 on it, you may actually get further ahead than if you get the $25,000 car and find out it has $5,000 or $6,000 worth of remaining needs. So this is a simple math problem, but at the root of it is an even bigger problem, that most cars that are for sale at the top of the market have more needs than the sellers are disclosing. So remember that. When you buy a car at the top of the market, it usually has more needs than the seller is disclosing. And even if the seller is willing to disclose all the needs, they may not know about all the needs. So there are some problems there that have to be dealt with that nobody knows about until you get it and determine what the ugly truth is. Now, when you're getting into more modern cars like an 85 300D or a similar car, let's say an 84 380 SL or a 126 300 SE, there are times when it pays to look for a better car that's well maintained. And then there are times when it doesn't. For example, if you're mechanically inclined, buy a car that needs some mechanical work, some suspension work, some brake work, maybe some climate control work, so you can exercise your mechanical inclination. If you find a 300 SE that's a nice car that has higher mileage and some mechanical needs for $2,000, and then there's a 55,000 mile example floating around out there for $10,000, it's possible to have just as good of a 300 SE for $2,500 and then lay out, you know, some free labor on your part and another $2,500 in parts, and then you'll end up with a pretty decent car. Now, the cheap Mercedes adage becomes more true when you start getting into the modern cars. When you look at something like an SLK or a 140 S-Class or a 212 E-Class, if you buy these cars which are constantly depreciating, in other words, they have at this point a negative financial forecast, they're losing money. Any money you put into the car is going to be lost money. So if you're looking at something like a 2002 E320 wagon, buy a good one that's been serviced religiously. Don't buy a cheap one, because you'll end up spending $1,800 in a cheap car and $5,000 in a nice car. But once you buy the $1,800 car, chances are you're going to have to put about, you know, up to $7,000 or $8,000 into it, especially if you need the services of another party. Again, if you're mechanically inclined and you understand the cars, the statement doesn't really apply to you. But if you don't understand the cars, then it does apply to you. Now, personally, I would rather have a decent car that's priced below market that I can go through and work out some of the issues on, because I feel that not all sellers of the best cars are going to be honest. I'm going to want to find out where all of the problems are before I commit. And it's easier just saying I bought this car inexpensively. I could commit several $1,000s to it because I know I'm not at the top of the market yet. And even if you go a little bit over market prices, remember that the person who has bought the $25,000 car, such as the case of our 280 SE 4.5, is actually going to spend more money. Whether they want to or not, if they want a perfect car, they are going to spend more money. So just don't buy a rusty car with a fire or a really terrible interior, or, you know, a bad accident damage that's lingering under the car. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like our page, and go ahead and subscribe if you haven't yet. And think about supporting us on Patreon. A lot of our Patreon members rave about the fact that we have always been there to help them. And both Thomas and I make sure that all of the questions that our Patreon members send get forwarded to me so I can answer them quickly and effectively. Also, if you have a video request, think about supporting us on Patreon as well. This is a good incentive for us to keep churning out the videos that our Patreon supporters want. And finally, if you haven't shared this video, please do so, and enjoy driving your Mercedes Benz. Tap the bell for notifications, and don't be afraid of a cheap Mercedes. Don't judge the car by its price.